I am delighted to be here. I had honestly hoped we might be in person. I miss that, as I'm sure you do. Now, I'm going to begin this sermon in a place you definitely don't expect. Some of you may remember the movie Auntie Mae, of a free-spirited New York socialite bringing up her nephew in a most unorthodox manner. I love her because she's free-spirited. I don't have much in common with her. I'm certainly not wealthy. But there is a moment in that movie and play where she's close to despair after having lost her job before Christmas. It's a sad moment. She's worried. But instead of giving in to the despair, she decides that she's gonna, since it's a musical, she's gonna break out into a song. We need a little Christmas right this very minute. And some of you may remember that, and they all dance around. I love that moment. And I feel that what we need right now, all of us, is a lot of hope and defiance right this very minute. How do you feel right this very minute? I, for one, I'm in sore need of hope. Look at all the things we're dealing with. We thought we were on our way out of COVID restrictions. Then came Delta, and then came Omicron. Oh, we all hoped that, well, not all of us, some of us hoped that common sense would prevail and more people would accept science. Nope, didn't happen. The divide between the waxed and unvaxxed continues, along with the masked and unmasked. Sounds kind of weird, doesn't it? The masked and the unmasked. When will we ever have said that before? Some of us want to see voting rights reformed and enshrined in law again, as in the John Lewis Voting Rights Bill and the Freedom to Vote Act. But yeah, that looks doubtful at the moment. The distrust and division in Congress is so strong that even some compromises that Republicans are bringing forth that might help save some aspect of our democratic process and our up till now well-functioning, honest, reliable election system in most places, they're seen by the other side as traps. Is this republic that we call the United States in danger? Will democracy prevail? And how is this a religious issue? Well, as Unitarian Universalists, our first principle is the inherent worth and dignity of every single human being. Every single one. Even the ones you don't like. Even the ones you have a hard time sitting next to in church. Even the ones that you totally disagree with. The principle still applies. And our fifth principle lifts up the right of conscience, the use of the democratic process in our congregations and in society at large. Okay, I will admit, democracy is often messy and it can be chaotic. I have certainly sat in some church congregational meetings in despair as it went on and on and on, and then a little bit longer, and finally became a contest in how, and a futile exercise in how well you knew Robert's Rule of Order, which some people say is the Unitarian Bible, by the way. But even then, frustrated, I would never have it any other way. Democracy to me is sacred. Democracy to me is a religious issue. And my goal here today is to encourage you to remember that. And don't do what King said some white moderates did, which was keep quiet. Silence is acquiescence. There are many reasons to despair, but there are many reasons to hope. And today I want to take you back to Selma. Now, I have a personal connection because I served the church in Birmingham that was very much involved in that whole thing. And I'm sure you know a lot of what I'm going to tell you, but I want to tell the story because just like in some churches they read scripture, this is also a kind of scripture. So, Selma, Alabama. Selma, Alabama is a very small town. It's divided by a river, surrounded even now by cotton fields. And the quote that I chose for like something to think about, the hands that once picked cotton now pick presidents, reflect a hard-won reality. I actually got it from a bag I bought in the gift shop at the Selma Voting Rights Institute, just so you know. And if you go there, of course, and I went there several times. One time I was lucky enough to go with other Unitarian Universalist ministers who had been there, including the two who were with James Reed when he was beaten. And of course, you go to the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And at first, you're a little bit disappointed because, it's a very ordinary bridge. It's concrete and steel and spanning a muddy river. If you traveled in the South at all, you have likely crossed hundreds of bridges like that. But what makes it special and sacred are the people who marched across that bridge. They were beaten and bloodied and wounded by Alabama state troopers. And some were became famous eventually. Congressman John Lewis, he nearly died on Bloody Sunday. And then, of course, he went on to become a congressman. And one sign of hope is that when he died, they pulled his casket with horses across that same bridge. And Alabama troopers stood and saluted. That's progress. That is progress. But I want to remember the ordinary people. I want to remember the ones who marched, who came from Selma. And there were many teenagers who marched, young people, and were beaten. Why did they march? Because if their parents marched, they would lose their jobs and livelihood. So the children went out there instead. When you hear things like that, I almost want to cry. I really do. To do so much, to give so much. Most of those are forgotten, anonymous. Now, as most of you know, on February 26th, an Alabama state trooper killed Jimmy Lee Jackson, 26-year-old Black civil rights worker. It was in response to his murder that the Reverend Martin Luther King and a Southern Christian Leadership Conference called for a march from Selma to Montgomery to demand voting rights for all citizens. Now, remember at that time in the South, if you were Black, it was almost impossible to vote. It was almost ridiculous the way they kept you from it at times. There were places where you had to go and register and then you had to pass a test. But some of the tests were utterly insulting and arbitrary. Like there would be a glass jar full of candy or full of beans or something. And they would say, in order to vote, you have to guess how many beans are in this jar. And that's insulting. And then you also visit the violence from the Klan, of course, but also from those who were supposed to be lawful, the police and others. So after Bloody Sunday, that horrible Sunday, you can still see, you probably have seen it on television or somewhere, how they beat, how they used tear gas, how many were wounded. So Dr. Martin Luther King called them people of faith, ministers and others, to come to Selma and march with him to Montgomery. And so now imagine you are somewhere else in the country, let's say Boston, where James Reeb was, and you get this call, and what do? You're going to go down there in the middle of the firestorm? Are you going to go down there and face the violence? James Reeb had a hard time deciding. He was married with 4 young children. But he did decide to go down there and flew to Birmingham, which was the nearest airport, which is where my old congregation come in. Now, this congregation in Birmingham, they didn't come in and leave like a lot of people did. They came in, did the marching and left. No, they have to stay there. It's their home. But they picked up James Reeb. They picked up many other ministers at the airport. They took him to breakfast at the church. What a lovely thing, huh? Breakfast at the church, and they drove some of them to Selma. And this was literally risking their lives. There's no doubt about that. During the breakfast, the secretary of the church got a phone call. She answered rather annoyed. Well, I tell you, you're just going to have to take a number. There are plenty ahead of you. When asked what was that about, she said, oh, just another bomb threat. Yeah, members literally took turns sleeping in the church to keep it from being burned down. So James Reeb was there. He went down to march. He was turned back again. And that night they decided to go out to dinner at a place called Walker's, and I've eaten there. It was still there some years ago anyhow. And their menu is mostly fried chicken and sweet tea. Lovely way to experience the South. Well, not if you're diabetic with a sweet tea, but nevertheless. Reeb and 2 other Unitarian Universalist ministers, Olaf Miller and Clark Olson, decided to walk over to Brown Chapel, where King was going to speak. James Reeb was walking on the edge of the sidewalk. And they hadn't gone very far when 4 or 5 white men came at them from across the street. They were frightened and they walked faster. Then they realized that one of the men was carrying a stick. And then when the attackers reached the ministers, one swung his heavy stick and smashed the side of James Reeb's head. Miller and Olson were beaten and kicked on the sidewalk. Reeb was seriously hurt. Now, how do you find help in a city that's deeply hostile to outside agitators? They found a phone at the Boyton Insurance Office. They got an ambulance from a Negro funeral home. And so they were going to get James Reeb to safety, or at least somehow to the hospital in Birmingham, because the white hospital wouldn't treat him, and the colored hospital did not have a neurosurgeon. So they started to drive, and the police car escorted them out of Selma, and then they left them. They had a flat tire. They were surrounded by a mob, very angry. They couldn't change the tire. They drove back again to Birmingham, got another ambulance, and went on their way. And what I hear is that when they sat there in the ambulance, they kept watching the headlights, thinking it might be the Klan. Well, Reeb underwent surgery, and he was there in the hospital unconscious. Now, this made the news. This is one of those moments, when all the media get very excited. And James Reeb had been beaten. He was in critical condition, in sharp contrast to the media silence that greeted Jimmy Lee Jackson's death 2 weeks earlier. That evening, the news all over the country carried the news of a white Unitarian Universalist minister who had been attacked in Selma. President Lyndon Johnson sent a government airplane to take Marie Reed to her husband's side. But on March 11th, 2 days after he was beaten, he died. His death at the time so shocked the country and the US Congress that President Johnson sent the Voting Rights Act to Congress. He invited Dr. King to come to Washington when he was going to sign it. But King said no. He was preaching, he was giving the eulogy for James Reed. That's what he was doing. And he said, James Reed says something to each of us, black and white alike. We must substitute courage for caution. We must be concerned. His death say to us that we must work passionately, unrelentingly to make the American dream a reality, so he didn't die in vain. But he also said, we asked the question, who killed James Reed? But there's another poignant question. What killed James Reed? James Reed was murdered by the indifference of every minister of the gospel who has remained silent between the safe security of stained glass windows. And this is a part I really want you to hear because it seems to describe our time. He was murdered by the irresponsibility of every politician who has moved down the path of demagoguery, who has fed his constituents the stale bread of hatred and the spoiled meat of racism. He was murdered by the brutality of every sheriff and law enforcement agent who practices lawlessness in the name of the law. I'm really sad that he could be saying this today. And it would be true. I hope it had come a little longer. Now, it sounds so, yeah, I had hoped that. And another thing that's very familiar and very similar to today is the segregationists started spreading lies about James Reed. Oh, he wasn't beaten up by white separatists, segregationists, or the KKK. No. He had gone to a bar, gotten very drunk, and got into a fight. That was one lie. An even worse lie, more obnoxious, more outrageous lie, was that he was actually killed by civil rights activists to make segregationists look bad. Doesn't that sound a little bit like the way some people are talking about January 6th? It was really Antifa. Oh, no, it couldn't be us. No, we couldn't do such a thing. Why am I telling you these stories? Because they're not told enough. I mean, they're not told enough. My son didn't know who James Reed was. And I never I don't hear about him much. I know a lot because I was in Birmingham, of course. But I want to tell you that history repeats itself. And I think we are at another moment. As this hymn that we played for the offertory said, once to every soul and nation comes a moment to decide. I wish it was only once. But you know, freedom is not something you win, then you have it forever. That's not how it works. It's a constant struggle. It's something each generation have to win again. I invite you to make a difference. I urge you not to be silent. And you may think, well, what can I do? No, of course. I mean, I actually dealt with some of that problem when I was the minister in Birmingham, because we never could do enough as far as social action went. Because, you know, you can't march in Selma every day. Not possible. So no matter what we did, for some people, it was never enough. Well, I'm not going to tell you what to do. But there are things you can do. You're intelligent people. You're smart. You're Unitarian Universalists, for heaven's sake. You can write to your Congress people. You can write to Congress and tell them, for heaven's sake, take what you can get. It's not all or nothing. It's not either or. Darn it, do something. You can, in your own life, talk about this, because never doubt that you have power. You know, when women were fighting for their rights, the 19th Amendment, the last state was Tennessee. You know, well, the last state that would bring them over the majority, the 36th state, was Tennessee. It didn't look hopeful. You know, it didn't look like they had the votes. There was, you know, just one vote there, but that vote would keep them from getting it. And, you know, this was back a very different time. The ones who were against women's right to vote would wear red roses in their buttonhole. And those who were for it would wear white roses. Well, there was a young man there, relatively young. I think he was in his 30s. And his name, I think, was Aaron Burr. I may have that wrong, but I can look it up later and I'll email it if necessary. But anyhow, what I remember about him was he was against women's right to vote. He showed up that morning in the legislature with a red rose in his buttonhole. But guess what? His mother sent him a message. She talked to him. And guess what? He voted for women's right to vote, much to the consternation and fury of the other people in the legislature. Don't ever doubt that one vote can make a difference. Don't ever doubt that something you say, maybe something you have no idea matters, to someone may not make a difference. Don't give up. Don't be silent. Be like Auntie Ming. Nope. Despair, you're not going to get me. Omnicom, I can beat you. I'm going to move on. And I am going to believe that we can still change the world for the better. And if there's anything Unitarian Universalists ought to fight for, it surely is the voting rights. It's at the heart of who we are as a religion. There is hope. It lies in us. Like an ancient song for justice, it calls us to our better selves. We may look back and wonder at Selma and say, how could they be so brave? They just did what needed to be done. They fought for freedom. Now it's our turn. Amen. End of sermon.